Well, here we are. What are we doing, Pop?
We are going to take a look at some carburetors
Mm-hmm.
and two of them and kind of do a head-to-head.
All right.
And we're going to do the Carter Thermoquad and the Rochester Quadrajet. Kind of see which one's better. There are advantages to both of them.
Yep.
And so we're going to kind of point those things out, and that's what we're going to do. All right, Jacob. So doing a shootout between these two carburetors, we got the Rochester Quadrajet. Now this carburetor was introduced in 1965 on 396s, and overall they're pretty decent carburetors. Overall, these are pretty good carburetors. There are things about these carburetors that make them better than some. Okay, so I'm not a Rochester Quadrajet aficionado, so I may miss a few things. So if somebody else has some ideas, go ahead and mark them down. All right, so let's take a look at this just a little bit closer here. We got an air valve in here. We got little tiny, let's just look at it from this angle here. We got little tiny primaries and big secondaries. The goal of this carburetor was twofold. One of them, obviously 4-barrel, it's considered as a performance type thing. You don't put 4 barrels on cars that you just want to go down and get food from the grocery store. There's no need. So it was intended to make power. It was intended to be able to really do something good. So that's the quadra part. Okay, now what these carburetors, the better we mix fuel, the cleaner the emissions are, and the better we mix fuel, the better the economy is. But one of the things that's nice is these little tiny primaries on this carburetor. Now, you have to, you could drive, if you have big carburetors, you go down the road and you barely crack the throttle and you're doing the speed limit. Well, that never gets the carburetor off of its transition from idle to the main circuit. But when you have little tiny primaries, in order to run an engine, you're going to have to open this up a pretty nice amount to get enough air to make the engine go down the road at 55 to 75, whatever miles an hour. So with this open this far, that allows the signal, the low pressure being made by the pistons, to get up to these nozzles down here. And the nozzles are a little hard to see with the lighting we got, but these nozzles are made to really spread that fuel out. And so not only do we have nozzles made to spread the fuel out, we've got small throttles, so we really got to open them up a lot, let that signal get to them, and allow it to really pull hard on those nozzles and really stir that fuel up and get it mixed. And that is what's one of the advantages to this carburetor, is you get economy out of a 4-barrel. You get economy, out of a more kind of high performance type engine. So that to me is an advantage. Now here's something that when I was younger and I started running around in my cars, I noticed that if you had a 2-barrel V8, I don't care if it was Pontiac, Chrysler, whatever, the factory 2-barrel engines, that they would get 15, 16 miles per gallon. It wasn't too bad, not very good, but not super hurting. But with these 4 barrels on them, you could get that same kind of gas mileage, if not a little bit better. We used to get 18, 19 miles a gallon out of a 340 when you're on the freeway, 10 miles a gallon in the city, in town, but you could get upwards close to 20 miles a gallon out of a 340. And a lot of it had to do with these little tiny primaries and this real nice, beautiful mixing ability. So that's a plus about these carburetors. Now, the Thermoquad, it has the same thing, okay? It has those really good mixing nozzles down there and the teeny tiny primaries, so that the throttle has to be opened up a considerable amount in order to make enough air fuel to make the engine produce enough power and enough speed to go down the highway. So it ended up mixing fuel beautifully. Now, one of the advantages to this carburetor here. Now, let me just say this real quick. On these carburetors, I'm not talking about all Rochesters and all Thermoquads. Some of them are smogged out. You can't even adjust these idle mixture screws unless you cut things and change things.
Yeah, pull out plugs.
Pull out plugs, yeah. And so I'm not talking about every one of them. I'm talking about the overall, in general, design of these carburetors. Okay, these carburetors were intended for a purpose of some economy and obviously power because the 4-barrel. We've already talked about that. All right, so now we kind of know the purpose of each carburetor in general. Let me talk a little bit more about this. Okay, this came out in '65. This came out, I don't know what year, but in the late '60s, and it literally originally was made as a high performance replacement to the Rochester Quadrajet. Okay, now let's talk about one of the advantages here, because this one's in pieces where we can take it apart a little bit, and then this one here. Okay, so because we're talking about gas mileage, this is the power valve on this carburetor. Okay, now it's got little needles down here, or what they call metering rods, and they're tapered, and as this moves, that taper, as I go down, the fat part of the taper goes into the jet to lean it out, and as I come up, it richens it up. Well, it's spring-loaded, and it operates on vacuum, but it also has mechanical connection. There's a cam down here hooked to the throttle. So let's take a look at the cam. And right here is the cam. So this right here comes all the way up, and watch this one here now. As I open the throttle, you see how it's moving there? I'm holding it against it. So that cam makes sure that it pushes this up to give good jetting when you're going down the road. Too lean doesn't make power either. So this makes sure that it opens up to a good amount, even if you have enough vacuum to hold it down. Well, this is super tunable, because if I want to increase my horsepower, let's say, or I want to jet it richer, I can change these needles up here. Let's say my mid-range is a little bit rich or lean. I can change these metering rods, and that taper on the needle is at a different location so that it allows this to get richer or leaner. Now, down below where the jets are in here, if we need to get richer overall in the picture, we have to take the carburetor apart, and we have to just physically change the jets. And there's the jet down there. Hard to get the light on it, but there's the jet down there. Okay, so the needle's going down into that jet. Now, this is an advantage because we can make all these changes. We can change the spring, we can change the needle, no problem, right here on top without disassembling this carburetor. So that's an advantage. Also, this has another advantage where, can you see that little tiny screw in there? We can run that screw up or down on the fly to change the overall picture of our primary jetting. And that's cool. That's an advantage. The Rochester now, it's the same carburetor. It's supposed to be getting mileage and tunable, or not tunable, but it's supposed to be getting mileage and all that. But if you look at this carburetor, it has all the same things. The metering rod is tapered. All those things are the same. Let me get this. I don't know what I got hooked up here. Come on now, come apart. Oh, it's just the gasket. Okay, let me get this apart here. Probably cut a lot of that out. Okay, so here's our top off of our carburetor. Here's our tapered needles right here for our primary jetting. And if you look, there's our tapered needles. Okay, and it may be hard to see there, but that goes tapered. It goes down in the jet. The further down it is, the lean it is, the higher up, the richer it is. There's a spring down inside here, and that spring pushes this up. It pushes it up when we go wide open to give full enrichment on the primary side. And if our jet is big enough, that full enrichment, it sit right there in that little tiny hole. Okay, if overall our picture is lean, we can go in here and change those jets. Can you see those with the camera? You can change those jets. They unscrew and they're serviceable. You can take them out. So as far as the primary side goes, these are not as friendly to adjust. These aren't as easy to do. It's fully adjustable. You can get all needle, metering rods. You can change the spring tension here. You can adjust it, but you have to take the carburetor apart to do it. So here's where this thing, our power valve or power piston or whatever we want to call it, it sits down on top of this very hard to see little piece of metal down here. Okay, now this on the fly adjustment right here, this moves with the cam. The Rochester does not have a cam, so you can set the height of this overall height, but this is, you got to knock this little plug out, and then there's an adjusting screw in there that you can change the position of the height of this thing right here. And that will change where this sits. That will change the cruise jetting, let's say. So you can on the fly make those adjustments, but you can see it's blocked. It's not easy to get to. It's just not as easy here, okay? So the advantage as far as primary tuning is concerned goes to our Thermoquad.
Yep.
Okay, so as far as tuning the primary side for economy and power, the Thermoquad is definitely easier to tune than the Rochester Quadrajet. Now remember, both these were intended to do the same thing. All right, let's talk about secondaries here.
All right.
On the secondaries of the Rochester Quadrajet, they have these needle and seat that come out with this little screw. When the carburetor's all the way together, you just unscrew this. You pull these out and you have these metering rods. Now you see they're tapered. Those go down inside these jets down here. Okay? And those little jets now control how much fuel flows when you nail your secondaries open. All right? Well, now as this air valve opens, get that way. As this air valve opens, you can see where those sit is right here, and it goes up. So that pulls this needle or this metering rod, it pulls it up and richens as this valve opens further, this air valve. Okay, so this carburetor, if you were bogging it, whoa, and it only went that far, it only give it that much fuel. If you go wide open throttle and you're at 4 or 5 grand, and it's all the way open here, probably don't even need 4 or 5 grand. If you open, it goes all the way open, this comes all the way up and gives you the richness you need. So if you're not rich enough, you just change these. This is great, because if you go to the racetrack and it was one day real hot, and then you go the next time and it's real cold, or you go from the ocean to the mountains, most of the air when you're wide open throttle goes through these big hogs here. So the secondaries are so easily tuned by lifting those up and changing those needles. I wish the Thermoquad had that. It does not. So when it comes to just going from track to track and going racing in different conditions, this is the winner here as far as just being able to tune. You can make it a hair richer to compensate for maybe a lean mixture here that you're trying to get good economy with, and compensate by adding a little bit more richness in the secondary. It ain't the perfect thing, but it's okay. It's, if you wanted perfect, I guess you could make an argument there. But anyway, I love that about these Rochester Quadrajets. That's one of the things I really like, okay? Now, what I don't like is here's where the fuel comes out right here, okay? That fuel comes out, and you can see it's just a wide open tube, and it's pushing fuel off into this big gaping hole right here, okay? All that fuel has to find its way and spread out amongst this whole thing. It's going to go down into the intake manifold after it leaves here and spread to all the cylinders. But again, The carburetor's job is to mix fuel. The better job it does, the more torque, the more horsepower, the better gas mileage, all those things come together, including emissions. We don't want unburnt hydrocarbons coming out the tailpipe. Hydrocarbons, we have our engines, all of them, the best engine in the world. The hardest thing for the engine to do is get air into it. Air has what in it?
Oxygen.
Okay, so we need to get the oxygen in there. Now we put the oxygen in there, we put the right amount of fuel in there, but we blubber it out through this sewer pipe right here. And instead of mixing it good, we're going to shove a bunch of unburnt fuel out the tailpipe. And in a sense, we're wasting hard to get power already. Okay, so that's one thing I don't like about this. So advantage, easily tuned secondaries. As far as mixing fuel goes, the Thermoquad, here, hold this, has this in it. This is what we call a spray bar, or that's what I've heard it called. And you can see it's got holes that run along this tube. There's little ones and big ones all along this tube. And it sends the fuel across this channel. It's not like the Rochester where it just has something sticking in, blowing in there, hoping it spreads it out. It's spreading that fuel across the barrel, okay? And as it's spreading it across the barrel, that means that those molecules can get broke up easier and get oxygen around them, and you'll have less wasted hydrocarbons. That turns into more power. So even though the Thermoquad's a little bit more difficult to tune, you have to take this top off, change jets out in order to change secondary jetting. In order for that to happen, you have to lift the top. But because we're mixing fuel better, that's a big plus. That's a power plus. Also, just like the Rochester, if you want to richen up the secondaries to compensate for the primary, because the primaries are so easy to adjust, you can change the adjustment on the primary to help compensate for the secondary. But you can see that very little air goes through there compared to here.
Yeah.
So this make a little adjustment. You really need to make the adjustment here. In my opinion, this should be where you make your adjustment. All right. So as far as mixing fuel is concerned, Thermoquad wins. Okay. All right. Let's go to something else now.
All right.
A couple of the things that not too many people mention about carburetors is we always do what we can to keep our fuel cold. You'll see people put a cool can with dry ice inside of it and run the fuel through it. Now, cold fuel doesn't necessarily make a lot more horsepower. What it does do is as it disperses, it helps to cool the intake charge. And when we cool the intake charge, the air is smaller. And when the air is smaller, we bring in more oxygen. What's the hardest thing for our engine to do?
Bring in air and oxygen.
Bringing in air and oxygen. We can put all the fuel all day to. We can put a fire hose on top of our engine and blow fuel at it, and it'll bring it in. But it'd be too rich. We got to mix the right amount of fuel to the amount of air that goes in. That's why cylinder heads are so important. That's why turbos work. That's why blowers work. We want to get the air in because it contains what again?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. All right. So cold fuel is better. Now Thermoquads have this plastic body. Okay. Now this plastic body, when the engine is dead cold, is one temperature, and when the engine gets warmed up, the carburetor changes temperature. The hotter the carburetor gets, the richer the engine gets. Okay. Well, with this plastic body, we don't make such a massive change. Our cold adjustment is very similar, very close to our hot adjustment. So this plastic body keeps that fuel cold, which helps two things. Makes it so that our tune doesn't change so massively from hot to cold. It also keeps it so that our fuel temperature is low, and we keep our fuel temperature low. That helps to cool our intake tract, which allows us to bring more oxygen in because cold air is denser than hot air. Now there's another advantage here, and that is if you got a really hot summer day with one of these carburetors, that heat comes up through the engine when you turn it off, and it heat soaks the carburetor. And when you heat soak the carburetor, you boil the fuel out of it. They call it a vapor lock. Okay? These carburetors, if everything is right, do not vapor lock because the fuel stays cool in that plastic phenolic piece. Now, I've heard people say, oh, these things break off and, the body warps. Well, they do warp if something's wrong. If things are right, they do not warp. If your engine's getting so hot that it's warping one of these, find another mechanic. You need to find somebody who knows what they're doing because you don't. Okay? That is not a issue when these things are correct. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that is an advantage for Thermoquad. Advantage Thermoquad, temperature, thermo. Okay?
It's almost there.
Almost there. Almost to the finish line. All right. One of the advantages to a Thermoquad, and I don't mean to be picking on the Rochester because we're not talking about advantage. We're talking about the Thermoquad. One of the advantages to Thermoquad is it has 2 float bowls in it.
Yeah.
Okay? That has 2 needles and seats. That allows twice as much volume for fuel to flow into these float bowls. Now that's good because we don't have to have as much fuel pressure to keep this carburetor full. The other thing too, though, is when you go to nail the throttle, the fuel level has to drop slightly for the fuel to start flowing in because the floats need to drop to allow the fuel to come in. Well, as that float level drops, it changes the jetting of our carburetor. It'll make it overall leaner. In some cases, it could make it have hesitation issues. That's not here or here. That's not our problem. Here, we have overall, because the bigger bowls, we have easeability getting fuel and we keep our level up, and that makes our tune across the board from wide open throttle at low RPMs to wide open throttle at high RPMs. That makes this carburetor more consistent. That makes this carburetor now have even jetting. They call that a fuel curve. So fuel curves can be worked on here. And there's some holes down here, some air bleeds down here. You can work with those air bleeds, emulsification tubes. All those can be done if you're smart enough. Now, I don't know too many people know how to do that. But, if you're smart enough, you can take care of that fuel curve. All right. But this is better for that reason. Just out of the box, it's better. So now we have another win for the Thermoquad. And that win brings us closer to that finish line.
Yep.
All right, now I'm going to talk about a common problem with these. The Rochester Quadrajet, the way it's mounted is we have 2 bolts or studs here, and then we mount with these big long screws that go here from the top down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's what happens. There's a lot of mechanics out there that are new. They don't have the feel for how tight things should be, and they'll learn it eventually. Everybody gets in, and we all make mistakes. Everybody has made mistakes, sometimes costly, and we learn from those mistakes. We love our hobby, and we learn from them, and we'll move on from there. In this case here, one of the common mistakes is we can almost tighten this up almost as tight as we want. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not talking about 500 foot-pounds. I'm talking about what it takes to tighten these up. All right? And these here are going to be somewhat similar. The problem here is we got to go through this gasket and this gasket before we get to the base plate, the throttle. Okay? When we pull this down, if we over tighten this body warps like this. Okay?
Dang.
When it warps, it causes internal air leaks inside here, and it really messes with our jetting. It can make so we have air leaks on our air bleeds, air leaks go into our main circuit, different things like that. We don't want that, okay? That is something that if these are over tightened, we'll do. Now, you can take this when it's warped and put a flat edge on it, and you can take a file and you can surface this up and get this back in order. But there's a problem. I wouldn't do that too much because this is warped too. And if you fix this warp, you still have a warp here. Now you mismatches the 2 pieces together. So you need to make sure that when you put this together, this warp matches this warp if it is warped. Okay. Now, because you put a straight edge and you can see so many thousandths underneath it, well, you kind of need to do the same thing here and make sure that the edges or whatever are the same. So that's something to look out for on these carburetors. On these carburetors, we're mounted here, 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 and here. Okay, that's straight through the plate, nothing all the way down. And because it's nothing all the way down, we don't end up with that big warping issue. Now, you can over-tighten these two. I mean, there's always a guy out there, okay, that over-tightens the heck out of everything. So, advantage, Thermoquad. And that is not a major advantage. That's just a matter of ignorance, you know, a mechanic's ignorance. If somebody knows what they're doing, that is not a problem here. But it's really almost never a problem here. Okay, so advantage Thermoquad there. All right, now let's go to one more advantage, and we're going to go, this advantage is on the Rochester. We're going to give it last advantage. Okay, these carburetors, when you nail the throttle, what's the nickname?
Nickname?
Yeah, what's the nickname for this carburetor?
Thermo. Bog.
Yeah, thermo bog.
Thermo bog.
Here's another thing too. When the secondary is open and the low pressure comes up into this area here, that high pressure outside starts to push its way through here, and that's what starts to open this. Well, when you initially open the throttle, there's a lot of air that's going to start rushing into the engine that has no fuel with it. So that's what we like about a Holley double pumper, is a Holley double pumper has a secondary accelerator pump, and it shoots the fuel in to compensate for the extra fuel. These have an accelerator pump built into them. It does not pump, but what it does is, see these little chambers right here? These little chambers right here will fill up with fuel. There's a little tiny hole down here. Down there. And let's see if the camera can get this down here. Okay.
Right there in that little bitty corner.
Yep. So that fills this up to the level of the float level. And then these tubes run down into this little area here, this tube and this tube. And they are open right here underneath this air valve. So when you nail the throttle, the low pressure hits this air valve, and these instantly start dumping fuel into the secondary to compensate for the excess air that's running into the engine, just like an accelerator pump. This is an advantage on this type of carburetor, okay? So that's definitely a plus. All right, Jacob, so we got our head-to-head here, and it looks like Thermoquad made it closer to the screwdriver.
Yep.
Which one do you like?
I like Thermoquad better.
Why?
It hauls butt.
It makes power, huh?
Yep.
Yeah, it has advantage of making more horsepower.
Yep.
And again, this one here, I think is a little bit easier to tune as far as power goes.
Yeah.
Wide open throttle, this one's a bit easier to tune. But these two carburetors are, made for the economy, in my opinion. I'm not worried so much about the smog anymore. They're made for economy, and that one will do a better job of economy on the fly. So if I'm going to use this, that's why I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
I still got the power.
Yeah.
But if it was only about power, I'll take the secondary spray bar and tune what I need to tune to make this carburetor work. Not as easy as this guy, but this is the winner when it comes to dyno. Now, we don't have any dyno tests to prove it. But I'm going to tell you right now, Carter did not make that carburetor to lose to who they were building it for. All right, now let me give one more advantage to both of these carburetors. If you're running a General Motors car, Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, whatever used this carburetor, all your linkages fit, everything fits, your transmission, everything just fits. It goes right on. It just is, no mess around. And that's a big easy. And there ain't nothing wrong with these things when it comes to just getting her going down the road. The difference in power, I'll bet would be very subtle. You know, if you put it on the dyno, maybe 5. Okay. I want the 5, but maybe 5. Well, same thing here. If you're running an old Mopar about 71, 72 on, these carburetors right here, bolt on, they just fit. All the, you know, they got the throttle cable with all your linkage to hold it in place. All those things are there, and it just makes it easier just to reinstall one of these things as opposed to doing something different. So I think that's a plus here, and I think that's a plus here.
Woo! Winner!
Okay, well, if you liked the video,
Yeah.
make sure you make a comment to explain your theory, your idea, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about both of these dudes. Again, this is a good carburetor.
Yeah.
And with the proper tuning, it will not only be fast, but it has the advantage of getting good gas mileage like this one.
Yep.
This one does mix fuel better, but it's not as easy at wide open throttle to adjust, but it is the better piece overall. The winner.
Chicken dinner.
So, Jacob, what do you do when you like a video?
Like and subscribe.
That's right.